Frequently, when working on your designs in Revit, you'll come across some things that you want to create and you're not sure how to do it. And here's an example of a lovely scene from the Roche-Beaubois catalog. Very expensive, also very high design, nice objects, but you're not going to find most of these objects in the Revit Autodesk library. So how do you create this scene or recreate this scene or create any sort of design that you can come up with in your mind? Well, the first thing you want to do when you're making a scene in Revit is take a look at the design of the space that you're trying to create. And this, again, can be your own design or it can be something you see on a magazine. And in this case, what I would recommend is starting not by jumping into Revit and seeing what you can come up with, but instead do a diagram, typically in perspective and floor plan. These are the most helpful when beginning because you can identify overall strategies for how you're going to create the different elements in the project. And of course, projects are wildly variable, but there are some general strategies that you can come up with. And what you'll want to figure out, in particular, if there's a building, how is the building going to be modeled on the computer, the geometry? And that's true for either an exterior view or an interior view. You also want to think about the camera angle. Of course, you can't really do that until you have the geometry. Of course, furnishings and all those good accoutrements are wonderful, especially if you're trying to recreate something from the Roche-Beaubois catalog. And finally, lighting. Lighting is often done by a photographer in these catalogs, so there's a lot of fill lighting, and how do you create that on the computer? And first of all, when you look at whole buildings, it is a little different when you're looking at them from the exterior. And the reason for this is typically buildings are forced to have a lot of regular geometry because they're inhabited by humans. So even if it's a totally blobby building, it's going to need some standard things like doors and stairs and walls and columns. It has to obey the ergonomics of the human occupants and also structural considerations. And Revit, of course, is loaded with families that can create these standard elements very easily. And you can even customize them to a certain extent. You can make windows with rounded tops or doors that are octagons instead of rectangles. And they will still cut openings in walls. They still behave like good old Revit objects. You can also create non-standard elements, blobby or folded floors, columns that are shaped like mushrooms, and balconies with weird edges to them. And of course, each of these objects, you'll need to think about how are you going to put them together? When is it worth leaving the happy and safe world of Revit families and going out into the wild, wild west of Revit massing? So taking a look at a big building here, you might think, well, where do I even start? And of course, that is the hardest thing. You look at this and there are so many different elements to be created, but starting with the building massing is actually the best thing, because if you take a look at this just from what are the shapes involved? If I was making this out of giant pieces of cheese, what would I have to cut in order to get it to work? And then all the different elements will kind of fall in place. Now, the biggest thing is the massing of this particular building. It's a bunch of stacked boxes. So if you can draw a bunch of stacked boxes, you're well on your way to creating this entire building, even though it looks so complicated. It's really maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes all stacked on each other. Now, there are other things, the context and background. There's not much to see in the sky here. It's kind of gray, but there is a sky and it is gray. There are also buildings in the background. There's a site, which you would need to create. And we know that we can create sites in Revit. And of course, there are trees. Revit trees are not so great, but Enscape trees are wonderful. So we can definitely use those. Finally, Enscape can provide some site furnishings. There's a nice asset library, but you may have to venture out onto the internet, see if you can find site furnishings from manufacturers. You can even look for things on SketchUp, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but these sorts of different strategies, once you break it into pieces, you say, okay, I'll start with the site plan, or I'll start with the building mass, and then you can move from there. So probably the best place to start is by sketching out the site plan, just to see what are the shapes of the building that you see. And of course, you don't need to worry about things that you don't see in your site plan or in your perspective view. But even something as simple as this, I'm just sketching the building here, where the road is, and where the site is. It kind of helps you divide up what you need to create in your model. Now, interior views also need these plan diagrams, and there's no view that you can't figure out probably what the basic plan is. And something like this, we don't even see most of the space here in this image from the Roche-Beaubois catalog, but you can see that we could easily diagram out, oh, it's a fairly rectilinear space. It's got a carpet aligned with that rectilinear orthogonal, and it's got a table that is non-rectilinear in its base, but otherwise it's also aligned with all the walls and then all the other elements in the space. And you can diagram this in a number of ways, but what I like to recommend is that you just point at the different objects in the space and see if you can figure out how you might create these different elements. So for example, the view outside the window, well, you're probably not going to model that for an interior view, and it's not even all that much in focus, so you can easily just use an image that you can find. May take some doing to get an image that's close, but you can probably get pretty close. And things like the flower pot, perhaps there's one in Enscape, or perhaps you can find one, again, on the internet as an image file. The cabinet can be made as a custom extrusion in Revit. It's basically a box, but it has a funky relief pattern on it that you would have to create. The walls, well, there is a kind of reveal wall base, which is a little unusual, but again, this is a standard Revit element. We have walls, we have windows, we even have floors in Revit. And as we are all well aware, there's a wonderful asset library that we can grab materials from that have a lot of terrific things, including things like varnishes. So if we look at the materials, well, most of these can be grabbed off of that asset library. It may be that some things you need to go and get an image file to create it. For example, flooring is a typical one. And then the carpet may be the most difficult because, first of all, it's going to be very hard to find that image unless perhaps it's on the Roche-Beaubois catalog. If not, you may actually have to draw it. And in that case, there's a couple options. You can draw it in Revit as a split face onto a floor, or you could also try creating it in Illustrator, which has some wonderful facility for drawing, including making lines that are a lot smoother than in Revit. So sometimes working in Illustrator, especially if you have a tablet, is the best way to go. Other things, when you want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty, and absolutely you should do this before jumping into Revit, try to figure out, and again I've tried to mimic drawing this as a sketch, try to mimic what shapes are in the model and how are you going to create them using those good old Revit object types. And in this case, perhaps rectangular sweep for the table, swept blends for the base, another swept blend for the chair back. Even the chair legs can be a swept blend where there are there is more than one profile. Even lighting should be considered when you're thinking about putting your diagram together and trying to figure out how you're going to make this. In this case, there appears to be strong light coming in from the right, and less strong light coming in from a left window. Now, where is all the interior lighting coming from? Why isn't it dark and full of shadows? Well, it's hard to say, but probably because the photographer who took this photo used some fill light. We will have to account for that somehow. Now, in Revit, and particularly in Enscape, you can add ambient lighting and drop down the artificial lighting, and try to get that balance as nice as possible and as close to the image as possible. So let's take a look at some examples. And these are just from students that have done this in the past, and sometimes they draw them by hand. And this one in particular was drawn right over the perspective. Just, oh, how am I going to create that? Is it an extrusion? Is it a revolve? Is it a sweep? Is it a swept blend? These are for standard objects. And then she also drew the floor plan to indicate, well, you know, what am I going to have to use? Am I going to have to use walls, or are they going to be masses? And sometimes she wasn't sure. But by all means, trying to figure out, well, here's what I have to draw. Here's the scope of the problem. You can usually kind of get pretty far into the process without even touching Revit. And this is much more helpful. It allows you to kind of quickly jump into Revit and it'll be a little more efficient as you're modeling. That's a big part of this. You don't want to spend too much time modeling every single thing and trying to figure it out, when often there are shortcuts or there are easier ways to do things if you just stop to think about it beforehand. So some students did these on the computer. That's also fine. And she pointed at the different elements in the project and where she might find them, including finding things on the SketchUp 3D warehouse, which is very helpful. And manufacturers' websites are also often quite helpful, especially if you're pulling an image or looking for furniture on a standard manufacturer's website. They are often more than happy to provide you with 3D models, even if they're not in Revit. Here's another example. Again, just pointing at the different elements, trying to decide how to do it. This particular project came from architectural record, where there's usually a floor plan, which is very helpful. So, how do you create this model geometry? The biggest thing is to recognize, one, how you create geometry in Revit, but also that sometimes you don't have to create it. The easiest model to make is one that someone else makes, and I cannot encourage you enough to go and use these resources first. Do not burn up time when you don't have to. And the 3D warehouse is a great example. If you go to SketchUp, you will find that, guess what? There's all sorts of stuff. I just went to SketchUp and searched for Roche-Beaubois, and look at that. There's all sorts of great models here that are from the Roche-Beaubois catalog. Now, they are not actually from that company. They are from random people on the internet who've gone and created them. So if you look at the SketchUp model, and this is just of the, I think it's called the bubble chair. It's very bubbly. This one would be a bear to create in Revit. But here it is, already made. Probably there's some editing features that you can do within SketchUp. There are other issues that will come up. For example, if you want to paint this a material in Revit, you have to delete all materials here in SketchUp. You can literally just come and in your model delete all of the textures that are in the model. If there are different materials, you'll have to create a tag in SketchUp for each unique material. But then the worst problem is, because SketchUp models have these facets to them, they are triangulated. Nothing is really bulbous. It's actually just lots of little flat pieces. You could run into problems. In fact, I know you will run into problems if you try to use a material, for example, like the one they've applied here, that is meant to be fabric-like. What will happen is it will reorient the material over every single facet, and that's a difficult problem to solve. So despite the problems of SketchUp objects, I would strongly recommend checking them, and you can absolutely render them as solid materials in Revit without any problem of that faceting. All the weird lines disappear, and that works quite well. Anyway, look for objects on these other websites, and of course, Google is a good place to search. And those of you who have modeling skills in other programs, even AutoCAD has 3D, but things like Rhino are excellent for drawing blobby objects, organic shapes that are quite difficult to draw in Revit, as we will see. So the big thing is working out your design in Revit first. You need to break apart whatever you're trying to draw into its constituent shapes. Now, I'm going to start with some furniture elements because that allows me to talk about some simple shapes first. And the biggest thing is there are basically 4 standard shapes in Revit that you can build. There's an extrusion, a blend, a revolve, a sweep. Oh, I guess there's five, a swept blend also. And then there are also masses, which are great for warped objects. And by those, you can move points, lines, or planes, and you can get multiple profiles. So they allow you to do some more highly irregular objects. And if you can't find them in other programs, those are great. That's your options, basically, within Revit. Finally, don't forget you can use image files, and sometimes image files are great for things like mesh materials. You're not going to model something like a mesh, but you can draw a mesh and use it as a material with a cutout, and that works great. And of course, you can also import an image into Revit and trace it, although that doesn't always work great. Sometimes you actually can do better by going into Adobe Illustrator. And there's an image trace feature which will generate lines from your image, not always successfully, but sometimes for simple patterns you can actually generate a nice set of lines which can then be brought into Revit directly, and you can create something like a split face with that. So, and the objects, as I mentioned, there's, I guess, 5 official forms, they're called, in Revit. And each of these uses basically a profile and a kind of path. An extrusion, the profile is drawn on the ground and extruded straight up or sideways, whatever. You draw it on the work plane. A blend allows you to draw 2 different profiles, and somehow Revit does the magic of combining them. Revolve takes a profile and spins it around a central axis. A sweep takes a profile and allows you to essentially follow me, that profile, the SketchUp style follow me, along some linear path. It can be a line or a squiggle or a bunch of lines. Finally, a swept blend allows you to draw a path and draw 2 different profiles, and Revit will magically connect the 2. Now, these forms only work inside families, so that's where you create them. So immediately that forces you into using either a component modeled in place, where you can see the other geometry of the building, or frequently I think people find it easier to work on components as standalone components, particularly when it's a complex piece of furniture. It's nice to be able to rotate around the model, see underneath it, without having to deal with walls and floors and ceilings and the like. And all of these object types, these 5, can be void forms as well. And this is frequently what you have to do to create different shapes, is you create a simple shape like a simple extrusion, and then you apply a void to that extrusion to, say, give it a nice chamfer or profile along the edge, or make it look more like a cushion, for example. Now, masses are the other type of Revit object, and you can also mass in place in the model, and this is great when you want to squeeze something into some unusual geometric corner in your design. But also there are conceptual masses, which are, as the standalone components, they are standalone, separate from the rest of your model. These can be created, you can draw profiles just like you do in the regular forms, but you can have multiple profiles, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many you want, and these profiles can follow more different types of paths, including a 3-dimensional spiral, which is great if you have some form like a conch shell or something like that, which spirals not only in plan but also in elevation. And again, you can edit the point, line, or plane, which is super fun and nice. So, and once you've kind of considered all these shapes, now take a look at what you have to model. And again, I'm going to start with furniture because it has some of these sort of primitive shapes. If you want to create, say, the back of a chair, if you just draw the dashed line here as the profile of the chair and just create it a path for it to extrude. I mean, I guess it's actually not even a sweep, it's really just an extrusion going off in one direction. I suppose if you want the curve on the back of the chair, you'd have to add one extra little piece to it. But once you can identify the geometry of this chair seat, it's pretty simple, really. You do have to draw it. Even something like these legs, which seem, wow, they're wacky. How am I going to do those? Well, they're basically just a rectangle on top and a rectangle on the bottom connected by a line. It's a swept blend. And these, they may be rotated at weird angles and be connected to each other and look like they're folded, but each folded piece you can create in a unique, as a unique object and just modify it to have the look of the way it is in your project. Even something like that's bulbous, like a couch. Now, I'm not going to pretend to model the folding open part. You can't really animate objects in Revit. But I could easily create the base for this couch by drawing, again, that interesting bulbous profile, and then just creating a path that is the shape of the couch. The bulbous shape will sweep along that path. Now, it will need to be cleaned up to soften the edges, but immediately you can create that nice shape. Even something like a cushion. If you look at a cushion, which are kind of notoriously hard to make look good in Revit, it actually is just a kind of, I don't know, a bulbous shape that sticks up. If you can draw that profile, and in this case, it's a square cushion, so I could just draw the 1/4, or 1/2, I suppose, of the cushion and have it sweep around a rectangle, and like magic, you've got yourself a cushion. Again, you'd have to tweak the profile, and if you have a cushion which is different in profile on the front as it is on the sides, well, then you have a new problem on your hands. As for the front of the cushion, how do you chamfer the front? Because if I just draw the profile and extrude it along a sweep, what I'm going to end up with is a kind of straight edge on the front, and nothing looks more lame in Revit than when you have a straight edge, you know, kind of a hard edge made out of fabric, a 90-degree angle. So what you can do in this case is draw a void form. And this void is essentially a little curve that's going to eat away at the edge of the front of this mass sweep. And what that will do, that will give you a nice soft front to your couch. Perhaps a simpler example is just a tabletop. If you want, say, a kidney-shaped tabletop, you can draw that as an extrusion. Just pull it right up an inch or two, and then round the edge by drawing a profile that's a void. It's a swept blend, actually, not a void extrusion. And that sweep will follow the path of your kidney-shaped tabletop, eating away at the edge and making it have a rounded edge or whatever edge you want, an OG or that sort of thing. More complicated types of geometry are going to actually need to be, in this case, a taper. You'll need to have multiple parts to your project. Typically, this would be either a conceptual mass, or you could do as a mass in place if there's not too much stuff in the way. And the way you do that is you draw and you may have to figure out like how big this shape is. I had to actually draw it in plan and say, oh, okay, it's 8 different facets. That's going to look like a star in plan. Now, when I go to draw that mass in Revit, I can just extrude this star shape. Then using the Add Profile tool in Revit, I can break it into multiple layers, and then each layer I can make bigger or smaller. You can see each one of these is the same shape, but it is being shrunk down using the Scale tool to create your form. Revolves are great for things like bowls and plates and whatnot. They're quite simple, and again, you're only drawing really half of the model, or really just a profile of the model, and sweep it along a curve, goes around the center line. Quite simple. Now what do you do for the handles? You'd actually have to create a reference plane to draw a void extrusion that will eat away the handles, and I guess you'd have to make another one to eat away the rest of the model. And these do get complicated because now you're drawing reference planes on the ground that you can then use to draw these profiles. So the model suddenly is getting very complicated, but you ain't seen nothing yet, because if you wanted to create, say, a tufting effect, well, now you're really looking at a complicated element. Perhaps these are swept blends, and when you create the swept blend, you might have to do it in two pieces so that you can have two different materials. And to get these little indentations, these tufts, now you're going to have to create a void form that is a revolve that's going to eat into this. And sadly, it's still going to be smooth. So it's going to be quite hard to get these folds unless you're creating perhaps multiple void forms, eating away these little tufted pieces. And you'd have to do this in an array. But it can be done. Again, Revit may not be the perfect modeling tool for something like this, but if it's all you've got, you can make it work. And this is, of course, when you have just one piece of software, you have to find a way to make the objects work. Things like carpet patterns are generally, if you can find an image, well, you're done, right? It's a decal. And you would want to create a thin little floor, perhaps a quarter or a half of an inch thick, to put the decal on top of. And of course, the little bit of floor has to match the decal. And this will get you the shadow pattern. So even if you add, say, a shag carpet onto this, you will need to, you'll need to give it a little bit of depth just to get that shadow line. Now, things like creating curtains, that actually is surprisingly easy. You can just do an extruded squiggle. Create a mass in place, draw a squiggle on the floor, and select it, and create form, and boom, you've got yourself a curtain. And then you can create multiple profiles kind of at different points along that curtain. And there you go, you've got a curtain. And you can use voids to create the holes at the top. You can actually really get pretty far just using these simple objects. And sheer materials. Revit has in its asset library sheer materials that will let some light through. But what if you want to gather the curtain? Okay, that's going to be really hard. Like that's just going to be a real nightmare to do in Revit. It probably can be done by using multiple profiles, but in all honesty, if you have Clothworks in SketchUp, just use that. It's going to be vastly easier. I think this would be a huge bear to create in Revit. So other things that you can do as you're creating furniture and geometry include creating a pattern out of just lines. In this case, I created it in Adobe Illustrator. Illustrator has some great tools for blending objects at different angles and creating multiple repeats. And then you can create a material where the white area between these spokes is a void and a cutout. And then the black area is obviously solid. And you may get pretty far in creating something that looks suspiciously like this base piece here. Again, you do have to use it in Illustrator. And once you're done, kind of warping it and multiplying it and blending it and all this, you can just save it as a JPEG. You can also take an image of some object and manipulate that in Photoshop. That's how a lot of the wire mesh patterns are created in the Revit asset library. They basically have taken a picture and cut out the background. And it works great. Revit manages to handle that transparency or the cutout very well. Finally, Enscape is a good spot for a lot of assets. They keep building the asset library up, and you can get a lot of objet d'art, but you can also get Enscape materials, and these include things like vines. And even if you don't use the Enscape vining material, it does have a material type, which is for plants and flowers, and they handle the lighting a little differently, just kind of the fringing of the lighting around the object. So you might want to use that as you go along. And those of you who are good at Illustrator, especially if you're trying to create objects that are blobby shapes, you might want to consider drawing them in Illustrator, especially if you have something like an iPad with a stylus. It's just a lot easier to draw smooth curves in Illustrator. You can edit them afterward. They have Bezier points that can be manipulated to get things just the way you want. Revit doesn't really have such detailed control. Then in Illustrator, you can export it. You can't send it to Revit directly, but you can export it to a DWG file format. And that file format can be imported directly into a sketch. So it can save you a lot of time, particularly, for example, if you wanted to create a logo. Perhaps you have a logo that you've grabbed off the internet. You can go into Illustrator and trace it, or you can even use image trace. That gets you the vector lines. Then create a split face in your Revit project, and when you're in that sketch, you can literally go to the insert menu and find your AutoCAD file, and boom, it will trace your lines and turn them into outlines. So a great option for that sort of stuff. So once you've created enough objects that you can have a space, a three-dimensional space, you'll probably want to, one, launch Enscape, because that's where your best rendering is going to happen. And to do this effectively, you really do need either a bigger screen or an extra monitor, or just go and sit by a desktop computer and call up your original image you're trying to recreate in one screen and put your Revit model with the Enscape window on the other screen. And then use all those Enscape tools that help you to make the view look as it should to match your original picture, including changing the field of view, the depth of field, things like fog, and of course the background image that you can apply within Enscape. And one last thing is, once you've got it kind of perfectly aligned, using the keyboard to move your eye height up and down, all that kind of good stuff, you can save the view back into Revit so that you can access it again. It may look funny when you go back to your Revit model, but that's awfully handy. Now, other things that you can do are you can figure out the lighting while you're in Enscape, and that, as I mentioned, typically has a lot more ambient light than this fill lighting, which just basically is a kind of general light. You can achieve this in a number of ways, but the Enscape ambient light is probably your best bet to start with, and turn down the sun, turn down the artificial lighting. And again, it takes some tweaking to get it to look like an actual photo. Finally, how about building modeling strategies? We talked about smaller things, furnishings, and these are all using mostly the standard forms that you see in Revit components, Revit families. Sometimes when you're modeling a building, you are going to want to use a conceptual mass. And the reason for this is frequently buildings, even though you have to have normal objects like doors and windows, frequently you're going to have geometry that is less rectilinear, or the form of the building, the overall mass of the building may be irregular, it may be faceted or blobby. But once you've created that blobby form, you can convert it into things like curtain walls or storefront systems or regular walls. And those allow you to use things like regular windows. So sometimes creating a simple conceptual mass can get you very far, and then using standard Revit objects applied to that conceptual mass, or something like a pattern is also really important. A conceptual mass, like I mentioned, you typically work on this outside of the main model. And these are so great when you have a model with many ins and outs. Maybe it's faceted, or it's blobby. Everybody loves blobitecture, or something like a Pringle, something which is warped in multiple dimensions. Well, that's going to be really hard to create using those swept blends. I mean, basically impossible. But there are some tools within conceptual massing which are super helpful. Anyway, and sometimes you just want to paint it, like if you want an unusual shape for, I don't know, tapered columns or something like that. You can just mask that puppy right in your conceptual massing environment. Just paint it and you're done. You don't need to convert it to columns. We're not doing contract documents or anything here. Oh, and finally, adaptive patterns are ones which are also great, and again, highly complex ways to create objects. So something like this building here, you might say, oh, well, where do I begin? Oh, no. But actually, it's quite simple, because really this building is just a simple roof. And if you can draw the profile of the roof, you can just essentially extrude it. And that's a standard Revit element, is a roof, and it's a standard way of drawing it. Instead of drawing it in plan, which is what we usually do, you can just draw it by profile. Now, of course, you do have to do some interpolation here, because this drawing is in perspective, and in Revit, you draw typically a roof in an orthographic view. So you might want to sketch the elevations to see, oh, is that front kind of more or less a square shape, or what? So that you know how to draw the roof. And almost certainly it will take some experimentation. And same with the walls. You might say, oh, these walls are super complicated, but actually maybe you're just going to use a wall with a glass structure to it. And there you go. You know, you just make a solid wall, but make it maybe an inch thick and out of glass, and you've got most of it. The little thin elements you might create using other walls going perpendicular, but they will join. Revit will join them, and you'll end up with nice lines on the front. Other objects in here that I'm not talking about, things like the floor, you need to create them well enough to create the kind of silhouette behind the glass, but those are, again, going to be standard elements. Even something like this, you might say, wait a second, there is no standard element that looks like that, like no way. But in fact, if you look at this, I mean, the roof is, again, basically an extrusion. And we don't have to draw it as a roof extrusion. In this case, the roof becomes the wall, becomes another roof, becomes another wall. You could do that as just a mass in place, and draw it as an extrusion, draw the shape and then create a form from it. Or draw an arc and create a swept blend. This front piece, you actually probably could do the cutout pattern based on this. I believe it's what they call a Voronoi pattern. And I'm sure if you went to the architect's website, you would find that pattern somewhere and apply that pattern as a cutout to a simple curving wall, and you're done. That's it. There's no windows, there's no glass, there's no nothing in there. Now, other objects, they look really dramatic, but in fact, these are really simple. I mean, it's basically just a rectilinear extrusion, this kind of pointy shape that is extruded straight up. And then there is a void or you could use a void to eat away at the interior. And any other elements that show up here, these look like I-beams, W-sections, they call them. You can actually just get those out of the Revit structural library and tweak it to be the shape that matches. Now, of course, the camera angle in this one is very dramatic and would take a while to match, but you can see that the volume, the architectural volume, is fairly straightforward. Now, even a shape like this, you say, whoa, okay, that's it. There's no way we're going to create that one. But actually, it's really just a simple shape that they've worked by moving the edges. Perhaps they've rotated the entire rectangular shape into the ground. And some spots are being eaten away by glass, but the glass is just a vertical glass wall. So, there's no unusual piece to that. Because doors have to work and doors have to function for human beings. We are frequently limited by these elements. And these other shapes, taking a simple mass and grabbing an endpoint or grabbing a line, and you can probably create the forms pretty quickly. This one is a real fun one. And again, you might look at it and go, what the, how am I going to create that? No way. But really, it's just a spiral. It's actually a couple of spirals. And the spirals have a rectangular pattern, rectangular profile. If you take that profile and you sweep it along this spiral shape, that's it. You're done. There's nothing else that needs to be done. I mean, obviously there's other things that needs to be done, but all these vertical windows you can see they're just flat windows drawn as one draws a normal flat window. There's no special element to them, except perhaps that they have to follow along a curve, which is another element that's complicated. But the overall shape of the building can be achieved quite quickly. Even something like this, which looks kind of confusing and dramatic and like, what is going on here? But really, it's actually just a bunch of stacked boxes, right? They're just boxes stacked and kind of offset on each other. And some have lighting embedded in the underside of the slab. It kind of obfuscates the essential simplicity of the model. And once you've created a simple stacked series of stacks like this, you can convert them to walls and floors. And once you've done that, well, if you've got a wall, you can just pop windows in it. They take the standard Revit windows, and even if you can't pop the windows in it, you can paint it with a glass material. So what does all this look like in Revit? Well, I am not going to create every single piece of furniture here, but I will encourage you to go follow the video here on the types of masses that are available in Revit and get moving on your projects.